All right, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining the Stanford Political Union tonight for our first spring quarter speaker event on the state of Stanford with President John Levin. My name is Yu Ching, and I'm the president of SPU, and I'll be your moderator tonight as well. And for those of you joining us for the first time, the Stanford Political Union, or SPU, is a nonpartisan student organization dedicated to fostering constructive dialogue on campus. Founded in 1938, we provide a forum for students to come together and have meaningful discussions about pressing issues with speakers of diverse perspectives, viewpoints, and experiences. And in these divided times, we believe it is not only possible, but necessary for Stanford students to speak with those who hold views they may disagree with or even detest. We therefore strive to create a student-led, student-facing space for dialogue on campus through our community discussions, intercollegiate conferences, and speaker events like this. And while dialogue is SPU's mode of engagement, we do not presume that it is inherently better than other forms of meaningful expression, such as protests or social activism. And tonight, we're honored to host President Levin to discuss the state of Stanford and how the university is going to navigate the Trump administration's recent policies and demands targeting higher education institutions. And we'll begin with a moderated discussion for about 30 minutes before opening it up to audience Q&A. And the Office of Student Engagement has also asked me to make an announcement. We ask you to not disrupt the event, and if you do, you may be asked to leave. And born in New Haven, Connecticut, President Levin attended Stanford and graduated in 1994 with a BA in English and a BS in mathematics. He went on to earn a master's degree in economics from Oxford before receiving a PhD in economics from MIT in 1999. President Levin joined the Stanford faculty in 2000 and served as the 10th Dean of the Graduate School of Business from 2016 to 2024, expanding programs in technology and sustainability. He is widely recognized for his scholarship in microeconomics, an industrial organization that received the John Bates Clark Medal as the outstanding American economist under the age of 40. This past year, President Levin succeeded interim President Richard Seller to become Stanford's 13th president. Please join me in welcoming President Levin. Thank you so much, President Levin, for coming and speaking with us.
Thanks for having me here, Yixing, and great to be here.
And first question to you. After 2 quarters at the helm as the president of Stanford University, what have been some of the biggest challenges, highlights, and lessons learned during your tenure so far?
Yeah, thanks. So really nice to get a chance to do this. Thank you all for coming out. I think what's obviously the current moment in higher education is a huge, hugely important, in many ways challenging moment for all universities in this country. So we're going to spend, I know, a significant amount of time on that. Maybe I'll just run the reel back for a moment to the earlier part of the year and just say I started in August as Yixing said, I came to Stanford originally as an undergraduate. I spent this is my 25th year on the faculty, first in the economics program, then at the business school, and then started in this role in August. And it's actually been a really wonderful year. It's been an incredible pleasure. One of the joys of being in this particular role, even relative to all the other roles that I've had at Stanford, is you get to see everything that's going on at Stanford across this huge array of different activities and schools. And Stanford is an amazing place. And so there's things going on out in the medical school and biomedical research, or in athletics, or in sustainability, or in the experience of undergraduate students that are really extraordinary. And getting to be in this role it's an incredible pleasure to get to see them. And when I started this year in August, our provost, Jenny Martinez, started last year, but she was also in her first full year. And so we knew one of the things we wanted to do this year was just to get out around campus and spend a lot of time and hear from people and get to know people. And but we also wanted to have a set of things that we were going to focus on for the year. And so we said this year that we had a few priorities that were going to be important for us. We wanted to strengthen the culture at Stanford of inquiry and curiosity and foster more constructive discourse and dialogue. So it's really a pleasure to get to be part of this event. And with this group, I think I'm really pleased with what has happened on that front this year. I I really have appreciated just the tenor of discussion on campus, hearing from faculty teaching in the college curriculum who have reported that this was a sensational year there. The E Pluribus initiative, which was started in the fall, the Stanford Civics program, just feel great about that. We wanted to ensure that Stanford was a leader in data science and AI. That was another big priority for this year. I think we are and will continue to be a leader in that area, and this is an amazing time of opportunity across so many different fields, and I think also in education. We'll talk a little more about that. And then we wanted Stanford to work better for its faculty and the students. And one of the things that I learned when I agreed to take on this role last April, I went around and talked to a lot of people, students, faculty, staff, and I heard a lot about how frictional they felt Stanford, bureaucratic and frictional they felt Stanford was. And that really surprised me because I've always thought of Stanford as an incredibly dynamic entrepreneurial place where if you have a good idea, it happens. I mean, you can get it to happen. People want to get to yes, and they want to make things happen. And that, to me, that's what kept me here for so many years. And so I really wanted to make sure that that's the kind of place Stanford is. And so that's been a big focus for the provost and I this year. And we asked our former provost, John Chimendi, and former president, Richard Saller, if they would form a small team to go around Stanford and try to clean up different processes, like the form for having a student party, for example, which was very long and I think hopefully doesn't exist anymore. And so I'm happy about how that's going too. This quarter and last quarter, obviously the national situation for universities has gotten much, much more complicated. And maybe I'll just say one or two things about that before we really get into the questions, because I know you're going to have a lot of questions about it. So just to frame things, I might make 2 points about it. The first is that American universities have enjoyed an incredibly successful partnership with the federal government, going back many, many years. And through the funding of scientific research in particular. And Stanford, actually perhaps as much as any other university in the country, sort of exemplifies the success of that partnership. When the federal government started to fund scientific research within universities after World War II, Stanford was a good regional university. And the federal support for science enabled Stanford to become a great national and then a great global university. Actually, I just noticed when I came in, we're in the Felix Bloch Auditorium. Felix Bloch is a good exemplar of that because he joined the Stanford faculty after World War II. He was an experimental physicist, and almost immediately he did a bunch of experimental physics research that won him what turned out to be Stanford's first Nobel Prize. And of course, there have been many, many, many great contributions since then. And part of what Stanford did was not only to use that funding for science to become a great university, but to demonstrate how universities can be innovative engines for the whole country and the world. And we've modeled that. So many of both the students and the ideas that have come out of Stanford have gone on to have incredible impact, and that just shows the strength when that partnership is working well of what it can achieve for the world. The second point I would make is that the idea of academic freedom, that is the freedom of students and faculty to study the topics they want, to talk about the topics that they want, is critical to that success. The academic freedom is what enables students to debate ideas that might be controversial. It's what enables people to take views on a campus that might be politically unpopular. This is important both for research. You've got to be able to question orthodoxy to do great research, and it's also important for successful liberal education of the type we try to provide on this campus. And to have that, students and faculty need to be protected both from internal and external coercion. externally, the First Amendment protects the freedom of students and faculty to be able to speak their minds. It's a founding part of the United States. And internally, that's the responsibility of the university. And actually, if you look at the university, we should recognize that at universities, we have not always lived up to our own internal end of that bargain. We have had cases in recent years where speakers have been shouted down, or where lists have been published of words that you weren't supposed to use, or students or faculty have felt that their careers or reputations were threatened because of something they said that people complained about. And that's one of the reasons that I'm very proud at Stanford this year that we have done so much in this area of civil discourse and in trying to protect the freedoms of students and faculty to be able to speak their minds. And that was why it was the first priority for Provost Martinez and I this year. It was how we welcomed the first-year students at convocation. It's why we have, why it's so great to have organizations like the Political Union and all the activities I just talked about a moment ago. And really, when there's a criticism of universities, such as not sufficiently protecting the freedom of speech on campuses, that is the way the problem should get solved on a campus. It should be solved by the university. It should be addressed and internally, as opposed to, say, under the threat of losing federal funding. I will just say, to me, this is a very important time for universities in this country. It's a time actually when there should be, if anything, more investment in universities because of all the opportunities to do incredible research, to do incredible science, to use the tools of AI, of machine learning, all the data, to have breakthroughs, whether it's in cancer research or neuroscience or whatever the topic is. And it's important that we work internally together, that we work with other universities, and that we work with the country to try to make that happen, to try to put the universities on better footing within this country and restore the successful partnership that has contributed so much to the world.
I'd love to pick up on the thread of external coercion, right? And as you mentioned, the university should be a place where people have academic freedom and be protected from these coercions. And as you may be aware of, yesterday the Trump administration halted more than $1 billion in federal funding for Cornell and $790 million for Northwestern. And previously it withheld $400 million in funding from Columbia University due to, quote, the school's continued inaction in the face of persistent harassment of Jewish students, end quote. And the funds were later restored after Columbia agreed to implement the administration's list of demands. And according to the AP, Stanford has received $991 million in federal funds in the 2022-2023 fiscal year. So if the Trump administration were to withhold Stanford's federal funds, how would the university respond to demands to change its internal policies and decision-making?
Yeah, so I'll say that Stanford it has a number of ways in which we're supported by the federal government. We have a tremendous, our faculty are some of the most successful in the world at getting federal grants to do biomedical research, to do research in engineering, to do research in energy, in a whole range of fields. And that's the number you're talking about. We also run a national lab, SLAC, for the Department of Energy. And my feeling is that on the types of topics that the administration is questioning at universities, I think we have a lot to be proud of in terms of what we're doing. That for example, on the issue of anti-Semitism, I think we have an affirmative case that we have done a tremendous amount to try to support the Jewish population on this campus. It's thriving in many ways, and we've addressed some of the issues that came up last year. For example, in the reports that were published in last June around having clear protections for speech, having clear rules around disruptions, consistently enforcing those rules, and and trying to foster a stronger culture of discussion on campus, even around really hard topics like the Middle East. So I think we have an affirmative case to make that we are doing many of the right things, a lot of the right things here at Stanford.
I do want to dive into a bit about the two committees that were set up following October 7th. So for those of you who may not know, since October 7th, college campuses like Stanford have been heavily scrutinized and criticized for failing to uphold students' right to free speech and for inadequately combating anti-Semitism. And last year, former President Seller commissioned two committees to investigate and provide recommendations on combating bias. And after conducting many listening sessions with the Stanford community, the Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian Communities Committee concluded that free speech protections are enforced unequally, identifying a Palestinian exception to free speech and expression throughout the university. In addition, the committee found problematic time, place, and manner restrictions that inappropriately curtail student speech. Meanwhile, the Anti-Semitism and Anti-Israeli Bias Committee concluded that anti-Semitism exists today, quote, anti-Semitism exists today on the Stanford campus in ways that are widespread and pernicious. So would you mind diving into a bit more of what specific changes Stanford has implemented or planned to implement to address those concerns?
Yeah, so those two committees that were formed last year spent an enormous amount of time going out and talking to people around campus, and then produced reports last June, and you summarized it well. And I've met with both of those committees several times this year, as well as talked to the leaders on many occasions. And there were some differences in the reports, but also quite a bit of common ground between them. And a big part of what both groups were concerned about was just effectively what we were just talking about, the state of discourse on campus. Both groups felt they wanted the opportunity to be able to speak, and in many cases to be able to speak in settings where people would be listening and there was a chance to have a real dialogue and so forth. And they were both frustrated by that. And then there were these issues around wanting consistent protections of rules for speech and protest and so forth. And so what we did over the summer, we had a faculty speech committee that had also been meeting last year, and it was Bernie Myler, who was a professor in the law school, this is her area of expertise. She helped us over the summer. She wrote, with a lot of assistance from other people, a very clear set of both clarity around the protections for free speech, which are very broad at Stanford. I mean, at Stanford, you are protected for using constitutionally protected speech. That is, First Amendment rights are the boundary of speech. That is very, very wide. And there's a second principle. One is to protect speech. The second is you can't disrupt things. You can't get in the way of other people learning. You can't disrupt the operations of the university. And Bernie and others put out those rules in a very clear way. And then we have done everything we can to try to enforce those consistently this year. And I think that was responsive. The other thing that these groups wanted was just more opportunities for, and this was a big part of the recommendations, was more opportunities for academic programming, for classes, for seminars, for opportunities for discussion. And actually, I have seen a huge amount of that this year, much more than we had last year. I think that was a big gap last year. There weren't very many opportunities to come together and just have a discussion with a faculty member in a classroom. And I think that was something where we recognized last year we could do better. And I think this year, really thanks to students, faculty, I think we have done much better.
And moving to more recent events, the Trump administration recently detained, revoked the visas off, and plans to deport several students involved in pro-Palestine activism as a part of an effort to combat anti-Semitism on college campuses. And the administration stated that these students were arrested for engaging in, quote, activities in support of Hamas, end quote. Meanwhile, the ACLU and other critics argue that these detentions are unconstitutional and suppress free expression on campus. If a Stanford students were arrested under these circumstances, how would the Stanford administration respond?
Yeah, well, what I'll say to that is we did have last week several students who had their visas revoked, and not because they were involved in activism in their case, and not because of any consistent country issue or anything like that that you've been reading about, each one for somewhat idiosyncratic reasons. The way we address that with that group, we have been addressing with that group of students, has been to try to work with each individual student who found themselves in a situation where their visa was revoked, and try to figure out what is the right thing to do for that student to help address the revocation of their visa, and to think about academic progress and how to proceed through the university. And I think, in any situation involving a small number of students that ran into immigration issues, the approach is how does the university work with that student to try to figure out what would be the best path forward for them. If there's a larger group of students, we would obviously need to have more uniform rules and policies. But when there's a small group of students, at least in my experience, when students have gotten into visa trouble, and it does happen at the university for all kinds of reasons, the most successful, everyone is different, their cases are different, the most successful approach is to try to help the person to bring different resources to bear, whether it's internal resources, external resources, to try to figure out a path forward.
Could you say more about the circumstances of these specific visa revocations at Stanford?
The ones from last week?
Yes, yeah.
It's hard with a small number of cases to speak to specifics of the cases. I think what I could say to them is each one had a separate somewhat idiosyncratic reason why their visa was probably flagged last week.
And they were unrelated to activism, or
they were unrelated to activism. There was no consistent pattern in any country, for example.
You have expressed a strong commitment to institutional neutrality and the need for Stanford, quote, as a whole, not to be a political actor, end quote, in order to create a campus environment where, quote, individual students and faculty can pursue their own ideas and thinkers can engage in debate, discussion, and dialogue. And I'm curious, how do you define institutional neutrality, and what are Stanford's institutional values, and what are we not neutral about?
Thanks for that question. So last year, many of you were on campus, and there was a sort of a year-long debate in the faculty senate about I'm not going to use the term institutional neutrality because I actually don't like that term very much. I think it has the wrong set of connotations. But there was a debate about whether university leaders should make statements about broad political or social things going on in the world, and it was a very good debate that took place over a couple of quarters, and at the end of it, the Senate voted to adopt a statements policy that said that university leaders, the president, the provost, the deans, the institute directors, would not make statements on behalf of the institution about political or social issues unless they bore directly on the university. And I was very in favor of that and spoke in favor of that. And I did it for two reasons. One is sort of a principled reason. That was a very practical reason. So the principled reason goes back to what the famous Calvin reported there in Chicago, the idea that having the university as an institution stay out of controversial topics is the best way to facilitate a campus where individuals on the campus are free to express their opinion and engage in a dialogue and be contrarian. And the famous line in the Calvin report is that the Calvin report does say that universities are meant to be questioning ideas that everyone believes in. That says the university, like Socrates, is meant to be upsetting in the sense of raising issues that people, sort of make people stop and think. And that the university is not the actor. The students and the faculty are the ones who get to speak. So that's the principal reason. The practical reason really had to do with my experience as being a dean for 8 years and sort of seeing the dynamics on campuses where what had sort of come to happen on campuses over a number of years was that something would happen in the world, and almost immediately, everyone in the leadership, all the university presidents and the provosts and the deans and the institutors, everyone would rush to put out a 400-word email with the same formula that would say, this has happened, and it's whatever it is, and then sort of saying exactly what was right, what was wrong, and I really came to dislike it, actually, and I stopped doing it. And the reason I didn't like it was I just thought it set a terrible example for students. That my view is that when you all come to the university, we want you to understand that so many issues in the world are actually more complicated than you first think, and there's different points of view. That's why we're on the Stanford campus with all these different perspectives and opinions, so we can hear from other people around us, and we should think slowly. We should sort of absorb, listen, try to hear different perspectives. Maybe we'll change our minds. And then if all the university leaders are out doing exactly the opposite every time something happens, it just sets the wrong example. It's not a good way to model thoughtfulness and inquiry for students. So that was why I was so firmly in favor of it, and I think it's been a good change for the university. Obviously, we're still early on. I will say, one of the reasons I don't like institutional neutrality is I think it makes it sound as if there's no role for leadership at the university. And I think that's also wrong, that there's a very important role for university leadership, first, to help to facilitate discussion and to get people thinking and talking, not necessarily to call exactly what's right and wrong, but to make sure that it's a good environment for dialogue and people feel okay to speak up. And secondly, there are times when you have to speak to the values of the university and articulate. The university does have a mission, a very important and enduring mission of research and education, and that mission needs to be articulated, and it needs to be explained, and it needs to be defended, and this is a time when that needs to happen right now, when everyone is questioning the value of universities. We need to talk about what is it that makes a place like Stanford so special in terms of the ideas we create and the students we graduate and what they go on to do in the world. And that is the mission. That is speaking to the mission of the university, and that's an important thing to speak publicly to.
I guess, are there any events that could happen that will warrant a university statement?
Oh, sure. There's certainly things that happen directly on a campus that, of course, would warrant a statement because it's directly about the university, and there's things that could bear directly on the university in an important way where you'd have to speak to it. But the principle, one way to think of the principle is it's a principle of restraint in order to enable dialogue on the campus. In fact, that's the term that others like Bill Bowen have used, that you think of it as a principle of restraint and not being out trying to make statements about all kinds of things.
I guess then the question is, what's the process that you go through to determine whether something would warrant an institutional response, right? I'm sure, like you said, there are things that would warrant one if they bear directly on the university. And the arguments that many are making now among students and faculty is that because democracy, right, or academic freedom is one of Stanford and one of university's values, and therefore we should take an institutional position against President Trump's actions that undermine democratic norms or university's academic freedom.
Well, I'll make it even more concrete. So, today we had a faculty senate meeting, and I started by giving opening remarks that were about many of the same things I started with here today. They were about the relationship between universities and the country, about the protection of academic freedom, about the way to facilitate, to enable changes on the university should they be needed. And those will be published tomorrow. And here's one of the questions that came up in the meeting, in the Q&A, was there was a request to make a number of additional statements about specific issues on the campus facing different groups of people, of which there are many at the current moment. Different groups that might feel that they have a particularly challenging time ahead of them. And what I said there was that I actually appreciated hearing about those. That was very valuable to hear about those groups so that we could try to do something about it. But that I didn't think trying to make many, many different statements was going to be a particularly productive way for the university to function. That a much better approach would be to articulate some general principles about how the university would respond if there were groups that needed help or there were situations, and then try to follow those principles consistently. And that would be a sort of framework for doing things. That's why when we started the quarter, Jenny and I tried to write out and articulate a small set of principles: protecting the mission of research and education, protecting academic freedom, and recognizing that the pluralism of the campus, the ability to bring all different types of people with different viewpoints and backgrounds successfully together, were core principles that we wanted to use to guide decisions.
And the final question before we turn over to audience Q&A, and you mentioned that the deans have signed on to this principle of restraint and neutrality. Does that extend to the faculty senate as well?
I believe the faculty senate, so this is actually an interesting one. This was debated at length last year. There's a long list of what qualifies as a governing body. By the way, still a little contentious around the edges as to exactly what qualifies. That's been subject to continued debate this year. The faculty senate is in that category. But certain other things, for example, individual faculty are not, centers are not, as an example. Centers might be around a particular, organized around a particular issue.
Okay, because I'm thinking about the censure of Dr. Scott Atlas, right?
Yes.
And I think that was a very contentious issue, and it kind of called into question whether or not the faculty senate should be issuing censure, so being neutral.
So I'll tell you what I said today in the Senate about that, actually, which was that has been an extremely contentious issue. It was debated at just a number of times. And what I said in the Senate today is, I think that the Senate, and I hope that'll happen this quarter, would take up a motion to commit themselves going forward, not to engage in censures of fellow faculty members. That the Stanford Faculty Senate has a number of very important purposes. It has some governance responsibilities, and it's a very important. Different universities have different types of senates or bodies that some don't have any. Some have senates, but they're only some of the faculty, like they might only be the H&S faculty. Stanford has a very special faculty senate because it has faculty from every school across the entire university, and they meet regularly. And it's a huge asset for the university, particularly if you have a challenging situation, because people know each other and they hear from colleagues who might think really differently about problems. So they have a very important purpose, and I think they should focus on that purpose and not sitting in judgment of going forward of colleagues. They have a great mission to fulfill.
And we'll now open up to audience questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. Please.
While the ASSU was developing a statement on student support for sanctuaries campus policies, it was reported that Provost Martinez, I guess, had private conversations and somewhat strong-armed the ASSU into tabling the statement. And I guess if the faculty senate made, I guess, a decision to support institutional neutrality without necessarily the explicit engagement of the student body, then I guess why should institutional neutrality try to be imposed by Stanford leadership on the, I guess, student body? And I guess why, as a dean, did you not, I guess, seek to engage the student body and maybe come to like a collaborative resolution amongst the student body and the faculty to kind of make a decision on, I guess, maybe Stanford-wide policy on institutional neutrality, as opposed to just delegating this decision to support institutional neutrality to the faculty senate?
Okay, so there's a couple of really good questions there, so maybe I can disentangle them. So one, you asked about the sort of immigration and the immigration policies. So I wouldn't view that as necessarily, if the question is how will Stanford manage interactions, say, with the immigration authorities, that's a matter of Stanford policy. We have to make decisions and have to explain them, and we should, and we do have policies. I mean, we protect student information. That's part of the federal privacy laws. We follow those. And so we would, and then we have rules around how we would interact if there was a legal reason where we had to interact with say, an immigration authority. And that's all clearly articulated. I would say, I can't speak necessarily for the whole university because I was the dean of the business school last year, but I would actually say, at least among the students at the business school where I was the dean, we actually talked a lot about these issues of institutional neutrality and speech on campus. That was a very big topic for discussion. And part of what sort of started that discussion in the business school, and I think some of those conversations happened in lots of other places during the campus. It was a number of things over the years, but in a significant way, it was the experience during the pandemic. And when we went online during the pandemic and the teaching was in Zoom, it made classroom interactions very difficult. I have never seen more frictions happen at the university in teaching, in faculty meetings, just in interactions, personal interactions, than I saw that year, partly because people were afraid from the stress of the pandemic, and partly because the interacting online was so, you forget that it's a person in the other square. And there were just so many incidents, and we started having discussions with the faculty and the students about how do we have a better culture in terms of the way we interact with each other and have people be able to talk and disagree. And one of the things I read something during that time, one of the faculty members, Neil Malhotra, who's a political scientist, sent me this article that had a huge impact on me at the time. And it was an article about different cultures that you can have for responding to conflict, basically. If someone says something that you disagree with, how do you respond? And so one way you can have a culture where if you say something to me that I disagree with, I escalate it. I fight back. That's a culture of honor. You can have a situation where you say something to me, I get upset by it, and I appeal to authority. So I take it to social media, or I say to someone else to come in. That's a culture of grievance. Or you can have a culture where you engage in a discussion. Why did you say that? Why do you think that? That's a culture of dignity. And so what we said at the time was, we want to have a culture of dignity. And then we thought about what are the ways to sort of enable that kind of culture. And one of them was let's not be just saying what's right, what's wrong. Let's try to get people talking and having discussions and being curious about each other. Given that for most students, most of you who come, this is the most diverse environment in terms of where people come from, who people are, what people want to do, how people think about things, that you've ever been in, and maybe that you'll ever be in. And that's the magical thing about being on a campus. We want to make the most of that.
Do you want to say your name and where you're from?
Yeah, my name is Ramon. I'm from Houston.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Sure, in the back. You want to say your name and where you're from?
My name's Turner. I'm from Eastern Washington State. Thanks for speaking tonight, President Levin. It seems like in the face of federal funding withdrawal, a lot of universities have been negotiating on an isolated basis. And as such, they've had to concede some pretty steep demands, it seems, to sacrifice their core institutional values. I'm curious if you've made overtures to other university leadership to undergo some kind of collective bargaining, and if not, what it would take to get you to initiate that outreach.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there is and has been already a lot of discussion amongst universities and a lot of cooperation on some issues. For example, on federal research funding, which is an area where many universities have been potentially impacted by changes in federal research funding. And universities, public universities, private universities, red states, blue states, purple states across the whole country, lots of collaboration in terms of thinking about that and thinking about how to work with Congress on that issue. We were part of the AAU, which is an organization of about 70 research universities, filed a lawsuit about the indirect cost cuts. We were part of that along with many other universities. On some of the other issues facing universities, I think there could be significantly more collaboration, and I think there both could and should be more cooperation between universities.
Hi, my name is Natalie. I'm a major in design, sophomore, and I'm from Brazil. So my question is regarding the situation of international students on campus. I think that this is a pressing problem that has been disrupting our regime here on campus. And I think that a lot of international students are like questioning themselves of like what Stanford is doing exactly, mostly on the academic end, in order to support us, since we have educated a lot of things in order to be here at Stanford. Just going back home without a degree would be extremely disruptive and devastating for us. So if you could please expand more on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so let me start by saying it is an enormous asset to the country that American universities like Stanford are able to attract students from all over the world. And we have a relatively small number of international students at the undergraduate level. We have a larger population at the graduate level who are admitted. All of our international students are admitted because they're outstanding. There's not a discriminatory process to admit them. They're admitted because they stand out, they're truly outstanding. And a very large fraction of our international students, after they graduate, stay in the country and go on to make incredible contributions to this country and then to the whole world in all kinds of domains, including in things like to innovation and the economy. If you just think about, like, we've had international students at Stanford who have graduated and go on to found NVIDIA, Google, DoorDash, Zoom, Yahoo. I mean, just this is a tremendous asset for the country. It's something that should continue and go on for many years. And there is more of a debate about it right now, including some countries that are being singled out. And I do think it's important for universities to make the affirmative case that this is in fact a really great thing for the country. It's actually part of the secret of why the US has such a competitive advantage over the world, because we are a beacon for the most talented young people everywhere. And that's great for the university, but it's even better for the country to have that model.
Hi, I'm Johnny, and I'm from Houston. And I just wanted some clarification on when you said that the university doesn't really make statements unless it's about its core values and principles. And so I was wondering if you could give like direct, concrete example that comes to the top of your head about a situation, either internal or external, that you could see would make the university make a statement of any kind.
Well, I just made one about the value of having international students on the campus, and that's a statement in this. I mean, in the sense that it bears on federal policies about immigration and visas and all of that, but it also bears directly on the mission of the university, because it's part of our model of trying to educate the most and attract and educate the most talented scholars, particularly at the undergraduate level. We have a smaller number of international students because we're an American institution, and undergraduate education has an important that's part of our civic. We think of that as part of our civic responsibility. And it's great to have a small number of international students because they enrich the overall environment. But at the graduate level, we seek to attract the people who are going to go on to, who are the most promising in their fields. And so that's how we've thought about what makes sense for the university, what makes sense for science, for research in all different fields, and it has an interaction with policy. So that would be would be a good example, actually.
Hi, I'm Allison. I'm from New York City. In a lot of this talk, you talked about, you mentioned earlier about Stanford as a liberal arts institution. And when talking about the things that Stanford is known for, you've talked about science and engineering and technology. And I'm wondering, especially as the kind of nationwide perception of Stanford becomes much more STEM focused and much more research focused, how is the university responding to that? Like, you were an English major, I'm a TAPS major. And so I think about this a lot, about what Stanford's reputation is and how that's changing, especially as the country changes.
Yeah, I love that. I thank you for that question. You know, so I sort of started, and you're exactly right. I've been talking a lot about science and engineering, partly because those are the fields that are funded by the federal government. I mean, to me, part of what makes Stanford an extraordinary university is the breadth of fields that are represented here. We are arguably the nation's leading engineering school, and we have extraordinary humanities departments and social science departments, and a sustainability school, and a medical school, and the professional schools. And the fact that they're all here together and people go back and forth, I mean, that is really a distinguishing feature of Stanford. The other thing I would say about that is, I mean, I was an English major, and I have to say, I sometimes tell this to people, I also majored in math, and sometimes I get asked, both those majors seem kind of useless. Have they had any use? And I say, absolutely. They've both had incredible use. I mean, the math taught me how to think really rigorously and logically. I went on to a career in economics, so it was something I used all the time when I was going on into graduate school and becoming a professor. But now I find that as I go on in my career, longer that I'm out, in leadership roles and just older, the more I go back to my English degree, because it helped. Humanities are all about helping you to put yourself in other people's shoes and have empathy and try to see different perspectives and try to think about big questions about what does it mean to live a good life. And the farther you get on in your life and in your career, the more important those things become. So the fact that we all are at an institution where you can choose to major in any of those different things and hopefully take some classes in the other ones, that's something to be celebrated, and it should be an important part, maybe the most important part of a reputation as an undergraduate institution.
Hi, my name is Landon Bradshaw. I'm a medical student here. Earlier this year at Green Library, the No Justice, No Peace flag was taken down. And reading the Stanford Daily and seeing sort of how the debate unfolded within the faculty senate, a certain professor challenging alleging institutional neutrality was broken, and as a result, it wasn't a violation of the policy, but it's still permanently taken down.
Yeah.
I think symbols are very important. And I'm curious, how would you define, what does it mean for something to be political? I think some things are being called political that I see being life-saving, for example, as someone who studies cancer disparities. So what happens when looking at communities who look like me are now political, and how does the institution define that in relation to the federal government?
Yeah. So thank you, great question. Actually, let me start with the last thing you said, which was about, I think there's an important piece there which goes back to something I said at the beginning about the freedom of faculty and students to pursue topics they want to work on. I think one of the things that we're seeing right now that I do think is concerning is people who work in different fields around the university feeling that there's pressure not to work in those topics. And that's something where it's important for for everyone at the university to feel that if they have a topic that they care about, that they're passionate about, that's their life's work or just something they're interested in, they have the ability and the freedom to do that. They're not chilled or curtailed either for internal reasons or for external reasons. The banner, that was a complicated decision, I believe. That was an issue that the faculty speech committee was set up to try to think after that statement policy was passed, was set up to try to figure out what were complicated cases that weren't clear. And they debated that. Actually, they debated that quite extensively over a fairly long period. And the banner was up on Green Library. It was a banner that was originally put up to advertise an exhibit in the library. And so in that sense, it was an advertisement for an exhibit. And libraries can put on different exhibits and then you can advertise them. And for someone who came, they might not have recognized that it was a banner for exhibit. And that was the other argument, that it looked like a political statement made by the university sort of to support a social movement. And the faculty group debated that, and they came to the conclusion that it violated the statements policy and should be taken down. And that was sort of where that decision came from. And
you said earlier that you felt Stanford has been a leader in data science and AI. Given the exorbitant cost of developing artificial intelligence, can you address how the universities remain relevant and how it plans to moving forward?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good one, and I think a tough one, because you look at what private companies are spending to be at the frontier in a field like AI, and then you look at what the university budget is, and it's a minnow to a whale. And if that's definitely on my mind. I mean, just to give you an example. So at Stanford here this year, we opened our first GPU computing cluster, supercomputing cluster. It's called Marlow. It's up at the National Lab. It has 248 of the top line NVIDIA chips, 248. Meta has 250,000 of those chips, 1,000 times more. So you look at that and you think, how can the university compete with the private sector? And so here's the way I kind of think about it. One is the universities, first of all, we just do something different than the private sector. Actually, this is important for the way you think about the overall science and research ecosystem of the country. What universities do can't really be but universities do much more basic science. They do sort of curiosity-driven science. They do science that is spread across lots and lots of disciplines. Companies try to take a few big problems and take them to scale. So they're solving. You've got a SpaceX sticker on your laptop. Even with all of the expertise at Stanford, if we brought it to bear, we probably wouldn't be able to take a giant rocket and catch it in the little tiny arms. We just aren't set up to sort of do one project like that. Companies can do that in an extraordinary way, but we can do something that they can't do, which is we can have people from many, many disciplines. We can have people who can sort of just explore ideas, who don't have to come up with commercial applications of their idea. Their ideas can sit around for 30 years, like, say, gradient descent or neural networks, and then they get pulled off the shelf to create large language models. So, and we give the ideas away. We don't try to make money. So I think we will be able to compete in scientific discovery and in fields like AI in the future. It's just the way we will compete is we will tackle different problems, and we'll compete by having great people across different disciplines. We'll have a human capital strategy instead of a physical capital strategy. We'll have enough physical capital, I hope. We have to figure out how to pay for it, but we will try to have enough. And then hopefully the cost will come down so the human capital strategy is the right one over time. But we have to play to our strengths in that area, and I think we have a lot of them.
What was your name? Where are you from? Oh, Matthew. I'm from Santa Barbara, California.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. We go to the back.
Hi, President Levin. Thank you for being here. I know you stepped into this role university president after spending, I think, 8 years as dean of the business school. My name is Lenore Migo. I'm a first year at the GSB. And so I was curious, just because all of my classes have been about leading with values and taking positions in times of ambiguity. I think the first, I'm sure you know, managing groups and teams and ethics are all about how we take those ethics into the business world with us. And so I'm just curious, like going back to this idea of institutional neutrality, of this policy of restraint, just how those principles align with the university's role in cultivating leaders and business leaders who are expected to engage with the world's most complex and polarizing issues. I think at the GSB, it doesn't feel like a lot of these conversations that should be happening because they're happening on the world stage with business leaders are happening in our classrooms and on our campus. And so I'm just curious on how that policy aligns with the values and the principles of the university that I apply to.
I love that you're asking that question. Thank you. I appreciate it. So I don't want to necessarily speak to what was taught in your class this year, but the basic idea in a leadership role, trying to be successful in any leadership role, you have to start by having a sense of what is it that is important to you and to the organization. Kind of what are you grounded in? What are the values? And so, at a university, what are the university values? At a university, the purpose of the university is discovery and learning. And so a fundamental value at the university is to sort of create an environment where the individual people who are at the university, the students and the faculty, who are the ones being educated, doing the education and doing the knowledge creation, have the freedom to be able to pursue that and be successful, have the opportunity, have the resources, and are not necessarily protected from ideas, but sort of have a sufficient, protection to be able to go out and articulate what they're thinking. And so the responsibility in the leadership role, the way to lead with values then, is to make sure that you're providing that protection and you're providing that environment for the students and the faculty. And university leadership is sort of interesting. It's different than corporate leadership. Corporate leadership is, often you're trying to marshal everybody to go in the same direction all at once. In university leadership, the part of what you sort of have to remember is a big part of your responsibility is just to create freedom for everyone else to achieve their aspirations. And then, by the way, you can have some of your own aspirations as well. But then when you're doing that, you're not steering like a giant boat. Like you're the admiral of a giant fleet. And so you can sort of point the way and say, we need to go in this direction, but everybody's going to sail their own boat. And sometimes they're just going to sail off in some totally different direction. Hopefully, if you're compelling enough, you can get enough people to sort of sail in the direction you're hoping. But you can't coerce them to do that. And so that's the sense in which I think part of leading with values in a university is to create space for the other people within the university to form their own opinions and to articulate them, form their own aspirations.
We are over time. Parting words, President Levin.
Well, let me say how fun this was. This was really a pleasure. I appreciate so many of you coming out and getting the opportunity to talk to all of you. And thank you for running the Political Union and really modeling an environment of discussion and hard questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming out.
Great.